Ren Calloway had 4 minutes to convince anyone that she was worth saving. 4 minutes before the last of the morning warmth bled out of the discarded coffee cup she'd pulled from the trash. 4 minutes before her body surrendered to the pneumonia that had been eating her lungs for 3 weeks. 4 minutes before she became another name on a list that nobody reads, filed under statistics that make people shake their heads at dinner parties before reaching for the wine. She didn't use those 4 minutes to save herself. She used 8 minutes to save someone else. But we'll get to that. First, you need to understand what it looks like when a city decides you don't exist. Not the dramatic version. Not the movie version where the homeless girl stands in the rain and someone hands her an umbrella. The real version. The quiet version. The version where you sit against a brick wall for 3 hours and 42 people walk past you and not a single one meets your eyes. Where you become a piece of the architecture, a smudge on the landscape, something between the fire hydrant and the newspaper box that people navigate around without ever registering as human. Saturday morning, February 10th, 8:43, 28 degrees outside the Riverside Roastery in Cincinnati, Ohio. But the wind chill dragged it down to 18, and 18 degrees feels like a personal assault when you're wearing a men's XL Navy hoodie with frayed cuffs and a burn hole on the right sleeve, pink high-top sneakers held together with safety pins and duct tape, and nothing else between your bones and the weather except 98 pounds of stubbornness that refuses to die. Ren Calloway was 17 years old, 5'4", but starvation had stolen the years from her face the way it steals everything else quietly without asking until she looked closer to 14, until her collarbones jutted like the wings of a bird that had forgotten how to fly, until the veins in her wrists showed blue through skin so thin you could almost read the suffering underneath like scripture. She sat against the brick wall outside the roastery, knees pulled to her chest, hands wrapped around a paper cup that still held a ghost of warmth from the espressos someone had thrown away 20 minutes ago. The cup was empty. The warmth was leaving. And Ren watched people stream through the glass door of the coffee shop with the particular stillness of someone who has learned that movement attracts attention and attention attracts cruelty. Inside, the roastery hummed with Saturday morning ritual, the hiss of steam wands, the clatter of ceramic on marble, the particular frequency of laughter that comes from people whose biggest problem is whether to get the oat milk or the almond. Ren could smell cinnamon and fresh roasted beans through the gap where the door didn't quite seal, and the smell was worse than the cold because it reminded her of mornings that no longer existed. Mornings with her mother. Lena Calloway had made cinnamon coffee every Sunday. French press, 2 scoops of dark roast, a full teaspoon of cinnamon stirred into the grounds before the water hit. She'd stand at the kitchen counter in the house on Birchwood Lane, hair still damp from the shower wearing scrubs, because she was always either coming from or going to a shift at the ER, and she'd pour 2 cups even when Ren was 12, and the coffee was mostly milk. Those mornings were the architecture of a life, the foundation that everything else was built on. And Ren didn't know they were the most important moments of her childhood until they were gone, because that's how it works with the things that matter most. You don't recognize the architecture until the building falls. Lena Calloway, emergency room nurse for 15 years at Good Samaritan Hospital. The kind of nurse who remembered every patient's name, who stayed past her shift when someone was scared, who once drove 40 minutes in a snowstorm to bring insulin to an elderly man whose pharmacy had closed. She had steady hands and a voice that could calm a room just by entering it, and she taught Ren 2 things that would define everything that came after. The first thing she taught her was CPR. Ren was 12. Summer afternoon. Lena spread a practice mannequin on the living room floor and spent 3 hours drilling compressions, airway checks, breathing techniques, until Ren's small arms ached and she wanted to quit. You never know when you'll be the only one who can help, Lena had said, kneeling beside her daughter, adjusting the angle of her wrists. And when that moment comes, Ren, when you're the only one, you don't get to freeze. You don't get to look around for someone braver. You act. Even if your hands shake, even if you're terrified, you act. The beat of staying alive. That ridiculous song with the perfect tempo. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. Repeat. Don't stop. Don't ever stop until help arrives or the person breathes. Ren had rolled her eyes. She was 12. CPR felt like one of those things adults made you learn that you'd never actually use, like long division or cursive writing. But Lena was serious in the way that only someone who had watched people die because help arrived 30 seconds too late could be serious. Promise me, Lena had said. Ren promised. The second thing Lena taught her was documentation. This was later. Ren was 15, and Lena had started dating Curtis Langford. Ren remembered the first time Curtis came to dinner. Tall, clean-shaven, the kind of handsome that came with a practiced smile. He sold insurance, drove a sensible sedan, coached youth soccer on weekends. He brought flowers for Lena and a book for Ren, something about marine biology, because Lena had mentioned Ren like the ocean and he'd actually remembered. He was charming. The word existed for men like Curtis. He knew how to hold a door, how to compliment without overstepping, how to make Lena laugh in a way Ren hadn't heard since before the divorce from Ren's biological father, a man who had left when Ren was 3 and sent birthday cards for exactly 2 years before disappearing entirely. Curtis Langford moved in 7 months later, proposed at Christmas. The wedding was set for the following spring. Lena never made it to spring. December 10th, single car collision on Route 32. The official report said ice on the road, said Lena lost control around a curve, said she hit a utility pole at 53 miles per hour and died on impact. Quick, painless. The kind of thing that makes people say at least she didn't suffer, as if the absence of physical pain somehow accounts for the obliteration of a life, a mother, a woman who made cinnamon coffee on Sunday mornings and taught her daughter to save lives. Ren was 16 years old when they told her, sitting in the guidance counselor's office at school because they'd pulled her out of biology, and she knew before they said a word because guidance counselors don't pull you out of class to deliver good news. The funeral was on a Tuesday. Curtis handled everything. Efficient, composed, the grieving partner who held it together so everyone else could fall apart. 112 people came. The minister said Lena was in a better place. Ren sat in the front pew and thought about how the accident report said the temperature was 45 degrees that night. 45 degrees. In Cincinnati, water freezes at 32. There was no ice on Route 32 at 45 degrees. She didn't say anything. She was 16 and her mother was dead, and nobody asked a grieving teenager about weather reports. But she noticed. Ren always noticed. The insurance paid out 60 days later. $180,000 to a trust account in Ren's name. Curtis Langford designated trustee until Ren turned 18. Lena had set it up years ago, back when Ren's father left, wanting to make sure her daughter would be taken care of if something happened. Something happened, and Curtis took care of it. For the first month after Lena's death, Curtis maintained the performance. Meals on the table, rides to school, checking in on homework. He was attentive in a way that made the neighbors nod and say things like, "That man is a saint taking on a teenager that isn't even his." The shift started in month 2. Small things first. Meals became irregular, then infrequent. Curtis started drinking in the evenings, then in the afternoons. He stopped asking about school, started leaving the house for long stretches without explanation. Ren would come home to an empty kitchen and a locked pantry and a note on the counter that said, "Went out, heat up leftovers," except there were no leftovers because Curtis had stopped buying groceries. By month 3, the guest room was locked. Curtis moved Ren's things to the basement. "Storage room," he said. "Temporary while I renovate your room." The renovation never started. The storage room had a concrete floor, a thin mattress, a bare bulb overhead, and a window so small a cat could barely fit through. The door had a padlock. The padlock clicked shut every night at 9. Ren tried to leave the first time in month 4, packed a bag, made it to the front door. Curtis caught her in the hallway. That was when he broke her wrist. Right hand, clean snap of the radius. The sound it made was like a pencil breaking. Ren screamed, and Curtis covered her mouth with his hand and said the words she would hear in her nightmares for years. "Nobody is going to believe you. You're a troubled kid with a dead mother and behavioral issues. I'm a deacon. I coach soccer. I'm the one who took you in when nobody else would. So go ahead, tell someone, see what happens." He didn't take her to a doctor, didn't set the bone, didn't wrap it. He locked her in the basement with a bottle of ibuprofen and a bag of frozen peas and left her there for 2 days while the bone began to heal wrong, the way broken things heal when nobody helps them, crooked and permanent and aching, every time the weather changes. By month 5, Wren understood the architecture of her captivity. Fed once daily, usually leftovers or canned soup, just enough to keep her alive, but never enough to give her strength. Locked in the basement, 16 to 18 hours at a stretch. Rope around her wrists when Curtis left the house for extended periods because he was afraid she'd try the door again. The rope burns layered over each other week after week until the skin on her wrists looked like a topographic map of suffering. And all the while, Curtis was withdrawing money from her trust. 10,000 here, 20,000 there. The mortgage payoff came first. Then a new Ford F-150 $43,000 of Wren's inheritance sitting in Curtis Langford's driveway. Then gambling debts, bar tabs, online purchases, $127,000 in 11 months. Lena's gift to her daughter spent on a man who'd never earned a cent of it. Wren knew about the withdrawals because of the second thing her mother taught her: documentation. Lena, the ER nurse, was religious about charting. Every symptom, every observation, every treatment documented in meticulous detail. If it isn't written down, it didn't happen, Lena used to say. And charts save lives, Wren. Not just in the ER, everywhere. Wren started keeping a notebook. Blue composition book, college ruled, hidden inside the lining of the mattresses where Curtis never thought to check. She documented everything: dates and times of meals, hours locked in the basement, the condition of her wrist, Curtis's drinking patterns, conversations she overheard through the air vent that ran from the basement to the kitchen, carrying sound like a pipeline of evidence. She photographed bank statements when Curtis left them on the kitchen table during the brief periods she was allowed upstairs. Used the camera on Lena's old phone, which Curtis didn't know she'd hidden in the basement ceiling tiles. Took pictures of the withdrawal slips, the mortgage payoff documents, the vehicle registration for the new truck. And she recorded conversations. The phone's battery was almost dead, so she used it sparingly. But 3 weeks before she escaped, she heard something through the vent that changed everything. Late night, Curtis on the phone in the kitchen. His voice carried down through the ductwork with perfect clarity. "Yeah, I know it sounds bad, but the money's almost gone anyway. She turns 18 in November. Then I lose control of the whole thing. No, I'm not suggesting anything. Look, accidents happen. Kids on the street overdose, freeze to death, get assaulted. If something happened naturally, the remaining 53,000 goes to me as next of kin, since she has no family." A pause. Curtis laughed. The kind of laugh that sounds like gravel in a blender. "It's not like with Lena. That was actually an accident. This is just letting nature take its course. I stop feeding her. I make winter hard enough. She either runs or gets sick. Either way, it solves itself. By spring, this is done. Memorial service, sad story about a troubled teen, and I can finally move on with my life." Wren lay on the thin mattress in the dark, the vent above her head whispering murder into the silence, and she wrote down every word. Oh, no. Verbatim. The pen shook in her hand, but the letters were clear. 3 days later, she escaped. Waited for Curtis to leave for his Saturday poker game, used a bent fork to work the padlock mechanism, the way she'd practiced 100 times in the dark, climbed through the basement window that was barely big enough for a body that starvation had made terrifyingly small, and ran. She took 3 things: the notebook, her mother's stethoscope, the only object Lena had left behind that Curtis hadn't sold or thrown away, and the old phone with its dying battery containing photographs that could destroy a man who thought he was untouchable. 9 months on the streets of Cincinnati followed. 9 months of dumpster meals and park benches and shelter wait lists that never reached her name. 9 months of learning that invisible is not a metaphor, but a physical condition. A way of existing that the world imposes on people it has decided don't matter. She tried to get help 4 times, 4 failures. The first was CPS. 8 months before the morning outside the roastery, Wren walked into the Hamilton County Department of Job and Family Services and asked to speak with someone about child abuse. They assigned her to Vernon Pratt, caseworker, 46 years old, caseload of 73 children, dark circles under his eyes and a desk buried in folders. Pratt visited Curtis's house, unannounced as required. Curtis answered the door in khakis and a church polo, reading glasses, perched on his nose, coffee mug in hand. The picture of suburban decency. He showed Pratt the guest room he'd prepared: clean sheets, stuffed animals on the bed, textbooks stacked on the desk, forged homeschool records in a binder, Progress reports he'd typed up himself. Pratt interviewed Wren with Curtis present because Curtis said the girl had trauma from her mother's death and would be uncomfortable with strangers. Wren sat on the edge of the stage bed in the stage room and tried to communicate with her eyes what her mouth couldn't say with her captor 3 feet away. Everything looks fine, Pratt said on his way out. Case closed. The second attempt was the police. 6 months before the roastery, Wren walked into the District 1 station already homeless by then and told the officer at the desk that she'd been held against her will by her legal guardian. The officer called Curtis. Curtis drove to the station with documents. Medical records showing Wren had been treated for behavioral issues as a child, records Curtis had fabricated with a letterhead he'd bought online. School reports indicating truancy and defiance. A printout of text messages Curtis had sent to himself from a burner phone pretending to be Wren threatening to run away. The officer told Wren to stop wasting police time. Sent her home with Curtis. The punishment for that attempt lasted 3 days. Wren didn't try the police again. The third attempt was a shelter. 5 months before the roastery, the Pine Street Women's Shelter had space, but they required identification. Wren had no ID. Curtis had kept everything. Birth certificate, social security card, school records, all locked in his filing cabinet. Without documentation, the intake worker said, "I can't process you. We have protocols, liability issues. I'm sorry, honey. Try back when you have ID." The fourth attempt was the emergency room at Good Samaritan, the same hospital where her mother had worked. 3 months before the roastery, Wren went in for the pneumonia which had settled in her chest like a permanent tenant. The triage nurse took her temperature and asked for insurance information. Wren said she had none, said she was homeless, said she needed help. A doctor saw her, prescribed antibiotics, gave her a 30-day supply and a referral to a clinic that had a 3-month wait list. Nobody asked about the rope burns on her wrists. Nobody asked why a 17-year-old girl weighed 98 pounds. Nobody asked because the ER was running on 6 nurses instead of 12, and the waiting room was packed, and there simply wasn't time to look past the symptoms to the cause. 4 attempts, 4 failures, 4 times the system designed to protect people like Wren looked right at her and decided she wasn't worth the paperwork. So now you understand the girl sitting outside the Riverside Roastery on the morning of February 10th. Not just homeless, not just sick, but systematically failed by every institution that was supposed to catch her. A girl carrying evidence of her own near murder in a waterproof notebook because she'd learned from her mother that documentation is survival and from the world that nobody saves you but yourself. The morning continued its ritual of rejection. The couple came first. Young matching winter coats, gloved hands intertwined. Wren asked softly if they could spare any change. The woman pulled away as if Wren's voice carried contagion. The man steered his partner around Wren like navigating a puddle, something unpleasant to be avoided, not a person to be acknowledged. The elderly man came second, went into the roastery. Wren followed just to feel the warmth for a minute. The man walked to the counter and said to the barista loud enough for Wren to hear, "Is she allowed to be in here?" Talking about Wren in the third person while she stood 6 feet away, as if homelessness made you grammatically ineligible for the second person. The college girl came third, sitting by the window with a social work textbook open in front of her, highlighter in hand, literally studying how to help people like Wren. When Wren approached, the girl didn't look up. "I'm studying, I can't help you." The irony was so thick, Wren could choke on it. But the fourth rejection was the one that broke something Wren didn't know she still had left to break. The church group. 4 women in their 50s and 60s wearing matching shirts that read "Faith in Action" across the chest. They'd commandeered the big table by the door and were planning a homeless outreach event. Wren could hear them discussing logistics, blanket drives, meal packets, volunteer sign-ups. They were literally organizing help for people like her, while Wren sat 10 feet away, needing that exact help. She approached carefully, voice soft because 9 months on the street teaches you that volume is threatening when you look the way she looked. "Excuse me, I couldn't help but overhear. Do you know if there are any shelters with space right now? Anywhere with beds available tonight?" The leader, a woman with silver hair and a gold cross around her neck, looked at Wren the way someone looks at a problem rather than a person. Pursed lips, assessment eyes, the expression of someone deciding whether engagement would be rewarding or inconvenient. Honey handouts don't help. You need to take responsibility for your choices. God helps those who help themselves. The other three women nodded. Righteous agreement. The comfortable theology of people who've never been hungry enough to test whether God actually shows up when you're the one doing everything you can and it still isn't enough. Wren backed away, returned to her spot against the brick wall, wrapped her thin arms around her torso, and made herself smaller, which is what you do when the world keeps telling you there's no space for you. You contract. You fold inward. You try to take up so little room that maybe the universe will forget you're there and stop punishing you for the crime of existing. The roastery door opened again, and everything changed. Sawyer Harding stepped out into the cold, 16 years old, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing a leather jacket that was 3 sizes too big for her because she'd borrowed it from her father that morning, and he'd laughed and said, "It looks better on you anyway, kid." The jacket was heavy black leather, worn soft at the elbows, carrying the particular scent of motorcycle exhaust and open highway that clings to certain garments like memory. Sawyer took 3 steps onto the sidewalk, a coffee cup in her right hand, steam rising from the lid. Her left hand went to her chest. The coffee cup hit the concrete first. The lid popped off and brown liquid spread across the ice in a pattern that looked like a Rorschach test, like the universe asking a question nobody would answer correctly. Then Sawyer's knees buckled. Wren saw it happen the way you see car accidents in a time signature that doesn't match reality. The way Sawyer's eyes went wide. The way her mouth opened but no sound came out. The way her body folded and hit the frozen sidewalk with a sound that was both dull and devastating, the sound of a life colliding with the hard surface of the world. Around them, the Saturday morning crowd materialized into witnesses, 20 then 30 people, coming out of the roastery, walking past on the sidewalk, stopping on the opposite corner. And every single one of them did the same thing. They pulled out their phones, not to call for help, to record. 30 camera lenses aimed at a 16-year-old girl, lying on frozen concrete, not breathing, not moving, while the algorithms of social media calculated how many views her death would generate. Nobody moved, nobody knelt. Nobody dropped their phone and put their hands on this girl's chest and tried to bring her back. And Wren understood something in that frozen moment. Something about the architecture of modern cowardice, how 30 people could stand in a circle around a dying teenager and not one of them would bridge the distance between witnessing and acting. How the screen had become a barrier, a permission structure for passivity. How easy it was to film tragedy, how safe it felt to document someone else's worst moment, and how terrifying, how absolutely terrifying it was to touch it. Wren's oversized sneakers scraped against concrete as she scrambled to her feet. The shuffle became a run, 40 feet covered in seconds that telescoped into something longer. Something that felt like crossing the distance between who she'd been and who she was about to become. Her backpack bounced against her spine. Her broken wrist screamed with every jarring step. Her lungs 3 weeks into pneumonia burned like she was breathing fire instead of February air. She dropped hard to her knees beside Sawyer Harding. The impact sent pain shooting through both kneecaps. But pain was just information, and Wren had been processing pain for 14 months. Her hands moved into position before her brain finished making the decision. Muscle memory. 12 years old on the living room floor. Her mother's voice in her head, steady and sure, the voice of a woman who'd kept people alive for a living. Check for breathing. Wren put her cheek close to Sawyer's mouth. Nothing, no breath, no movement of the chest. Check for pulse. Fingers against the carotid artery. Nothing. No beat, no rhythm, no life pushing blood through this girl's body. Someone call 911. Wren's voice cracked, hoarse from weeks of disuse and cold exposure. Not a voice that commanded authority. The voice of a ghost barely there. But her hands were already laced together, already positioned on Sawyer's sternum, already beginning. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The rhythm her mother had drilled into her. The beat of that ridiculous disco song. Perfect tempo for keeping someone alive. 30 compressions at the correct depth. 2 inches. Hard enough to crack ribs if you're doing it right, and Wren was doing it right because Lena Calloway had accepted nothing less. 2 breaths. Tilt the head, lift the chin, seal the mouth, watch for the chest to rise. Repeat. For someone Wren's size, 98 pounds of malnutrition and untreated illness, Effective CPR was an act of defiance against her own body. Her arms burned after 30 seconds. Her shoulders screamed after a minute. The wrist, the one Curtis had broken, sent lightning bolts of pain up her forearm, with every compression, the bone grinding against itself in the place where it had healed crooked. 2 minutes. Her vision started to blur. The edges of the world going soft like a photograph losing focus. 4 minutes. She tasted blood. She'd been biting her lip without realizing it, concentrating so hard on maintaining depth and rhythm that her teeth had opened a cut that bled freely down her chin. 6 minutes. Tears streaming down her face and falling onto Sawyer's jacket. Because this girl couldn't die. Couldn't just die right here on this frozen sidewalk while 30 people watched through their phone screens and did nothing. Please. The word came out between compressions. Broken. Desperate. Please don't die. 7 minutes. Wren's arms were shaking so badly the compressions started to lose depth. She adjusted, leaned her full body weight forward, using gravity to compensate for the strength her muscles no longer had. Her hands scarred from rope burns marked with an old cigarette burn on the back of her right hand, where Curtis had punished her for trying to hide food. Those hands kept working. Come on. Wren whispered it like a prayer. Come on, come on, come on. 8 minutes. An eternity compressed into 480 seconds. Sawyer's chest jerked. A gasp. Wet, ragged, desperate, the most beautiful sound Wren had ever heard. Air rushing into lungs that had been empty. Eyes flying open, unfocused, terrified but open. Alive. Wren sat back on her heels, shaking, sobbing, her hands covered in coffee stains and sidewalk grit and a stranger's survival. 8 minutes of CPR. 2 minutes longer than most trained adults can maintain effective compressions. She'd pushed past every physical limit her body possessed. The circle of phone cameras didn't lower. 30 people still recording, still watching through screens. But now they were filming something different. Not a death, a resurrection. Performed by the person in that circle who had the least reason to believe in saving anyone and the most reason to walk away. Sirens in the distance, growing closer. And then another sound drowning out everything else. The deep, thunderous roar of a motorcycle engine being pushed beyond every posted limit between wherever it started and this frozen sidewalk. Donovan Harding's Harley-Davidson didn't park so much as collide with the roastery lot. He was off the bike before the kickstand engaged. 6'2", 240 pounds of leather and ink and the particular fury that only a father can generate when the universe threatens his child. Road captain of the hellsangels Ohio chapter, 39 years old, former Marine Corps combat medic with 2 tours in Iraq, Fallujah, and Ramadi, where he'd pulled wounded men from burning vehicles and performed field surgery in conditions that would make civilian doctors vomit. He'd saved 42 lives in combat zones. He'd held friends while they died in places most Americans couldn't find on a map. He knew what crisis looked like at a molecular level. He took in the scene in one sweep. His daughter on the ground, color returning to her face, chest rising and falling, paramedics pulling in, and this girl, this skeletal, shaking, sobbing teenager sitting on frozen concrete in an oversized hoodie and duct-taped sneakers, looking like she might shatter if anyone spoke too loudly. Their eyes met. Donovan had seen this look before, not in Cincinnati. In field hospitals outside Ramadi, where boys barely old enough to vote lay on canvas stretchers with wounds that would define the rest of their lives. The look of someone who had survived something that should have killed them, who had been hollowed out by the experience until only the essential core remained, the hard, bright center that refuses to go dark. This girl had that look, and the scars to verify it. He moved slowly, deliberately, the way you approach something wounded that might bolt if you make any sudden gesture. Dropped to one knee in front of Wren, putting himself at her eye level, never breaking contact. Then he shrugged off his jacket. His Hells Angels cut was visible underneath leather vest with patches that told a story of brotherhood and road miles and a life lived outside the neat boundaries of suburban respectability. He draped the jacket around Wren's shaking shoulders. It was huge on her, warm from his body heat, smelled like leather and engine oil and something Wren had almost forgotten existed. Safety. The jacket smelled like safety. You saved my daughter's life. Donovan's voice was steady, calm. The voice of a man who had made promises in combat zones and kept every single one. You're safe now. Ren couldn't speak, could only stare at this man who embodied every stereotype of danger her life had taught her to fear. Tattoos covering both arms, a skull on the left forearm, a Marine Corps eagle on the right. Scars across his knuckles from fights he didn't start but finished. A road name Reaper that should have sent her running, but he'd given her his jacket, positioned his body between her and the crowd, made eye contact direct and steady and unwavering, the way you do when you want someone to know they've been seen, actually seen. Not as a problem to solve or a story to film or a statistic to shake your head about. As a person, a human being worth protecting. Then Donovan did something that broke Ren completely. He placed his right fist over his heart, then extended it toward her palm up. The biker sign of deepest respect, of blood debt. The gesture that means you have given me something I can never repay, and I will spend my life trying. Thank you, he said. Thank you for not walking away. From the stretcher where the paramedics were working, Sawyer reached out. Her hand found Ren's, small fingers wrapping around scarred ones. An oxygen mask fogging with each breath she wouldn't be taking if not for this stranger. Thank you. Sawyer's voice was barely a whisper. For not walking away. Ren's backpack had shifted during the CPR, and her notebook slid free. The blue composition book waterproofed in a plastic bag, pages dense with handwriting. Ren's writing and her mother's medical terminology, and CPR instructions in Lena's precise hand, and newer entries in Ren's shakier script. Dates and times and conversations recorded verbatim. Donovan noticed it. He noticed the medical terminology, the careful documentation, the systematic organization of someone who'd been trained to chart information the way nurses chart vital signs. He noticed the stethoscope tucked inside the bag, old but well-maintained, the name L. Calloway engraved on the bell. And he noticed the injuries, the way Ren held her left wrist against her body, the shallow breathing of someone fighting infection. The rope burns partially healed on both wrists, the cigarette burn on her right hand, the weight that no 17-year-old should carry, and the weight that no 17-year-old should weigh. What's your name? He asked it quietly. The way you ask someone a question when you already know the answer is going to change everything. Ren, her voice was barely above a whisper. Ren Calloway. Ren. Donovan nodded once. I'm Donovan. My brothers call me Reaper, and I need you to understand something. You saved my daughter. That means you're under club protection now. That's not charity. That's blood debt. You understand? Ren shook her head. Didn't understand. Couldn't process what was happening because 9 months on the street had taught her that good things didn't happen to girls like her. That kindness was either conditional or imaginary. That the hand extended in help always came with strings that tightened into ropes. You're coming with us, Donovan continued, to the hospital. You need medical attention. Don't argue, I can see it. And then you're going to tell me who hurt you, because I can see that too. The rope burns. The way you flinched when I moved. The fact that you're 17 years old and sleeping on streets in February. I can see all of it. I can't. Ren's voice cracked like ice under pressure. I can't go to a hospital. They'll call him. They'll send me back. Who's him? The question hung in the air between them. February cold. Siren sounds fading as the ambulance carrying Sawyer pulled away. The crowd dispersing now that the show was over, pocketing their phones, heading back to their Saturday mornings, already composing the social media posts that would reduce this moment to content. Ren looked at Donovan, at this man who'd just sworn protection to a stranger, at the empty space where the stretcher had been, where his daughter had lain breathing because Ren had refused to give up, at the notebook in its waterproof bag, at the stethoscope with her mother's name. And she made a decision. Not the kind of decision you make with logic, with pros and cons weighed against each other like items on a scale. The kind of decision you make with something deeper. The part of you that recognizes safety after months of danger the way a lost traveler recognizes home. Curtis Langford, Ren said. My mother's boyfriend, boyfriend. He was supposed to take care of me after she died. Instead, he locked me in a basement, starved me, broke my wrist, spent my inheritance. And I heard him on the phone saying that by spring I'd be gone, that accidents happened to kids on the street. The words came out like water through a cracked dam. 9 months of silence breaking under the pressure of finally having someone who was willing to listen. And then Ren did what her mother had taught her. She didn't just tell the story, she presented the evidence. She opened the notebook, spread it on her knees, showed Donovan the documentation. Dates, times, amounts, conversations recorded verbatim. Photographs referenced by page number stored on a phone she kept in a zippered pocket of her backpack. Nobody believes a homeless teenager, Wren said. Her voice was steady now. The voice of someone who had thought about this moment for 9 months and prepared for it the way her mother had taught her to prepare. So I made sure they wouldn't have to believe me. They just have to read. Donovan looked at the notebook, at the meticulous entries, at the evidence this girl had gathered while being starved and imprisoned with a broken wrist and no allies, documented with the precision of an investigator, because her mother, an ER nurse, had taught her that if it isn't written down, it didn't happen. How much inheritance, Donovan asked. $180,000, my mother's life insurance. I'm the beneficiary, but he's the trustee until I turn 18. That's in 9 months. He's already spent most of it, $127,000. And if I die before November, he gets what's left. Wren turned to a specific page, flipped past her own entries to something older. Bank statements she'd photographed, printed in tiny type. But that's not the worst part. Wren's voice dropped. She turned to another page. Her mother's life insurance policy, $180,000. Beneficiary Curtis Langford. Then she turned to the accident report. Temperature that night, 45 degrees, no ice. And Curtis borrowed her car that morning, said he needed to run errands. She looked up at Donovan with eyes that held the terrible clarity of someone who has lived with an unbearable truth for 14 months. He didn't just steal my money, he killed my mother. And then he tried to kill me the same way, slowly, quietly, the kind of death that looks like an accident or a statistic, the kind nobody investigates because nobody cares enough to ask the questions. Donovan stood. His face had gone still, not blank but controlled. The expression of a man who has seen evil before in Fallujah and Ramadi, in places where cruelty wore uniforms and carried weapons, but who understood that the worst evil is the kind that wears khakis and coaches soccer and hides behind a church deacon's smile. He pulled out his phone, made a call. "Priest, it's Reaper." His voice had shifted, not the gentle tone he'd used with Wren. Military command, the voice that had coordinated medevac under fire. "I need every brother within 200 miles at the clubhouse." Now a pause. The voice on the other end. Garrett Priest Whitmore, chapter president, 58 years old. Former Army chaplain who'd counseled soldiers through the worst moments of their lives before losing his own daughter Jessica to domestic violence 15 years ago. A loss that had rewritten his entire existence. "We've got a minor, 17, escaped from abuse. Guardian killed her, mother stole her inheritance, and is actively waiting for her to die on the street so he can collect the rest. She just saved Sawyer's life with CPR. She's got a notebook full of evidence that would make a prosecutor weep." Another pause. "Yeah, every single one." The line went dead, and that was all it took. Because brotherhood, when it's real, doesn't require debate, doesn't require committees or procedures or chains of approval. It requires one voice saying someone needs help and every other voice answering. At the University of Cincinnati Medical Center, Wren sat in an examination room, still wrapped in Donovan's jacket, still holding her mother's stethoscope. Dr. Kathleen Fairfield, who everyone in the Hells Angels Ohio chapter called Doc, worked gently around her, taking photographs, documenting injuries with the clinical precision that comes from years of emergency medicine. Doc Fairfield had known Lena Calloway, had worked with her at Good Samaritan before transferring to UC Medical. Recognized the stethoscope immediately, the engraved name on the bell. She didn't mention it. Not yet. Some connections are too important to rush. "BMIs of 14.8, Doc said quietly to Donovan, who sat in the corner silent, absorbing every word. "She's dangerously underweight. Her body's beginning to shut down. Another month like this, and she would have gone into organ failure. The wrist broken 11 months ago, never properly set, healed incorrectly. She'll need surgery pins and plates, but right now the priority is the malnutrition and the infection in her lungs. And the rope burns." Doc met Donovan's eyes, consistent with prolonged restraint. Weeks, possibly months. The skin shows repetitive trauma layers of healing over layers of damage. 50 miles away, Garrett Whitmore was reading the text message Donovan had sent. The club president stood in the center of the clubhouse, silver beard, trimmed neat reading glasses hanging from a chain around his neck. A man who had once counseled soldiers through hell and then lost his own daughter to the very kind of monster he'd spent his life fighting. Every case since Jessica had been personal. Every child saved was Jessica's ghost given one more chance. And when he read about Ren Calloway, about the basement and the notebook and the murdered mother and the girl who'd performed CPR for 8 minutes while dying herself, something locked into place behind his eyes. He made the announcement standing in the center of the room. 40 men in their cuts, all waiting. Brothers, we have a 17-year-old girl named Ren Calloway who just saved Reaper's daughter's life. She's been on our streets for 9 months running from a man who killed her mother for insurance money, imprisoned her in a basement, stole her inheritance, and is now waiting for Winter to finish the job. She has evidence. A notebook full of documentation that this girl assembled while being starved and beaten because her mother, an ER nurse, taught her that if it isn't written down, it didn't happen. The room was silent, the kind of silence that has weight. This isn't a request for volunteers. This is a mobilization. I want every brother from Cincinnati, Columbus, and Cleveland ready to roll by dawn. We are going to investigate Curtis Langford. We are going to build a case that puts him in a cage for the rest of his life. And we are going to make sure Ren Calloway survives to see her 18th birthday. He looked around the room, at men who'd fought wars, who'd lost people, who'd chosen brotherhood over isolation and loyalty over convenience. Men who understood that the word protect isn't a noun but a verb, and verbs require action. All in favor, silence. The ticking of the clock on the wall, the distant sound of traffic on the highway, the hum of the refrigerator in the back kitchen. Then every hand went up. Not a moment's hesitation. Not a single voice dissenting. 40 men voting unanimously to protect a girl they'd never met, because that's what the word brother actually means when you strip away the sentimentality and get down to the bone. By midnight, the message had reached every chapter in Ohio. By 2 in the morning, brothers were loading trucks, preparing bikes, making arrangements with WIFSA and employers, and whoever else needed to know that tomorrow belonged to something more important than routine. By dawn, the largest coordinated mobilization in hellsangels Ohio history was converging on Cincinnati. 180 motorcycles, 3 chapters, 1 mission. And at UC Medical, in a room on the 4th floor, Ren Calloway sat in a hospital bed for the first time in 9 months, feeling something other than cold. She held the notebook against her chest, the one she'd carried for 14 months, the one filled with evidence she'd gathered in darkness because her mother had taught her that documentation is survival. Through the window, she could hear it starting, low at first like distant weather, then growing, the sound of engines, not 1 or 2, but dozens, then scores converging, from highways and back roads and every direction on the compass. Thunder that wasn't thunder. Ren pressed her palm flat against the glass. The vibration traveled through her hand up her arm into her chest where it settled next to the heartbeat that Curtis Langford had tried so hard to stop. She didn't know what was coming. Didn't know that 180 men were riding through the dark for her. Didn't know that by this time tomorrow, Curtis Langford would be in handcuffs, and every system that had failed her would begin the slow, painful process of answering for it. All she knew was that for the first time in 9 months, someone had seen her, had looked past the dirt and the hunger and the oversized hoodie and the duct-tape sneakers and seen the person underneath. The girl Lena Calloway had raised. The girl who documented everything. The girl who knelt on frozen concrete for 8 minutes because her mother's voice in her head said, "You don't get to freeze, you act." The engines grew louder, closer, the sound of something arriving that had been absent from Ren's life for so long, she'd forgotten its name. Not rescue. Ren Calloway had already rescued herself. She'd escaped. She'd survived. She'd gathered the evidence. She'd kept her mother's stethoscope and her mother's lessons and her mother's stubborn, beautiful insistence that you help people when you're the only one who can. What was arriving, rolling towards Cincinnati from 3 directions in the pre-dawn darkness was something different. It was the sound of people who had decided she mattered. The sound of brotherhood mobilized not by obligation, but by outrage. The sound of 180 engines saying the same thing Donovan Harding had said when he knelt on frozen concrete and saw her for the first time. You're not alone anymore. Dawn broke over Cincinnati at 6:47 on the morning of February 11th. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees overnight. Ice crystallized on power lines and coated windshields in patterns that looked like fractured glass. And from three different directions, from the east along Interstate 71, from the north down Route 42 from the west, on Highway 50, thunder began to build. Not weather, engines. The sound started low and distant, the way a storm announces itself an hour before arrival, a vibration you feel in your chest before your ears register it as noise. Then it grew, multiplied, became a roar that rattled windows on Elm Street and set off car alarms on 6 consecutive blocks, and made a woman walking her golden retriever on Thornhill Drive stop in the middle of the sidewalk and stare toward the horizon like something biblical was approaching. 180 motorcycles. 3 chapters converging on a single address. Curtis Langford's house, 2847 Thornhill Drive, Oakley neighborhood. Suburban. Quiet. The kind of street where people mow their lawns on Saturday mornings and wave to neighbors they've known for 12 years and never once consider that the man 3 doors down might be keeping a teenager in his basement. The formation pulled in with disciplined precision. Tight rows. Staggered positioning. The muscle memory of men who'd ridden together for years, who could execute a lane change at 70 miles an hour with hand signals and perfect trust. They rolled onto Thornhill like a tide, leather jackets bearing the same insignia, chrome catching the thin February light, faces set with the particular expression of men who have traded anger for purpose because purpose is more dangerous. Now you might be thinking, 180 Hell's Angels roaring up to a suburban house means fists through windows and furniture in the yard, and the kind of chaos that makes the evening news. That's the story you expected. Maybe the story you wanted. The dramatic version where justice looks like violence and satisfaction comes from watching a bad man bleed. Garrett Whitmore didn't build a brotherhood on rage. He built it on precision. On the understanding that the most devastating weapon in any fight isn't a fist. It's a file folder. The bikes parked in perfect formation along both sides of Thornhill Drive, engines cutting off in waves, a cascading silence that felt heavier than the noise it replaced. 180 men standing beside their machines, not moving, not shouting, simply present. A wall of leather and controlled power that communicated everything it needed to communicate without a single word being spoken. Priest stood at the center of the formation, silver beard trimmed neat, reading glasses hanging from the chain around his neck. He looked like someone's grandfather, which he was, and like someone who had counseled soldiers through unspeakable trauma, which he had, and like someone who had buried his own daughter after a boyfriend beat her to death, while neighbors heard screaming and chose their own comfort over a phone call, which was the wound that had never healed and never would. Every case since Jessica had been personal. Every child they were protected was Jessica getting one more chance. And Ren Calloway's story had hit Priest in the exact place where his grief lived, the place that converted sorrow into action, with the efficiency of an engine converting fuel into motion. He surveyed the brothers assembled. Donovan on his right jaw, set eyes scanning the street with the tactical awareness of a man who'd cleared buildings in Fallujah. Douglas Mercer on his left, the man everyone called Bones, 52 years old, 20 years as a Cincinnati homicide detective, before the corruption and bureaucratic rot drove him to early retirement. Beckett Caldwell behind them, road name Wire, 28 former Army intelligence, the youngest patch member in the chapter, carrying equipment bags that contained more forensic capability than most rural police departments. And Dr. Kathleen Fairfield, the only woman wearing a cut ER physician who'd treated gunshot wounds and overdoses and every variety of human damage the city could produce, standing with her arms crossed and her expression suggesting that whoever had hurt Ren Calloway should start praying to whatever deity would still take his calls. Everyone clear on the mission, Priest's voice carried authority without volume. The voice of a man who'd led prayer services in combat zones and understood that true power never needs to shout. This is an evidence operation. We are not here for vengeance. We are here to build a case so airtight that Curtis Langford spends the rest of his natural life behind concrete walls. We do this right. We do this legal. And we do it so thoroughly that every system that failed Ren Calloway has to answer for what it didn't do. Heads nodded, grim faces. Men who understood that discipline was the difference between justice and chaos, and that only one of those would actually protect the girl in the hospital bed 4 miles away. Bones wire your own documents, financial records, public filings, anything we can legally access. Doc Medical Liaison, coordinate with Ren's treatment team for testimony about her physical condition. Reaper, you're with me. Door to door on this street. Every neighbor who saw something. Every person who heard something and said nothing. We document it all. The operation began with the coordinated efficiency of men who'd spent years executing complex rides through hostile territory. This wasn't a gang descending on a neighborhood. This was a machine calibrated and purposeful, each component performing its function with precision. Wire approached Curtis's house first, not to enter, not to force anything, just to document. He walked the perimeter with a camera photographing from public property, maintaining legal distance while recording everything visible from the sidewalk and the street. The basement window. So small that Ren at 98 pounds had barely fit through it during her escape. The padlock on what should have been a pantry door, visible through the garage window where the angle was right. The new Ford F-150 in the driveway. $43,000 of Ren's inheritance sitting on Curtis Langford's property like a trophy. Wire moved methodically, photographing the truck's plates, the house's exterior, the mailbox with Langford's name stenciled in neat letters, the soccer coaching placard on the garage wall. Every surface detail that established the gap between what Curtis Langford presented to the world and what he actually was. Meanwhile, Bones knocked on 2845 Thornhill, the house directly next door. White siding, blue shutters, a ceramic cat on the porch railing. Edith Sumner answered. 67 years old. Lived there for 12 years. Hair in curlers, bathrobe, cinched tight, a coffee mug in her left hand that she nearly dropped when she saw the wall of motorcycles lining her street. Mrs. Sumner. Bones showed her his credentials. Old Detective Shield technically expired, but the authority it carried hadn't diminished. I need to ask you some questions about your neighbor, Curtis Langford. Edith's eyes darted between Bones and the motorcycles in back. I don't want any trouble. Ma'am, the trouble already happened. We're documenting it now. Did you ever hear anything concerning from the Langford house? In any sounds, any incidents involving a teenage girl named Ren Calloway? The question landed like a stone in still water. Edith's hands began to tremble around her coffee mug. The girl, his stepdaughter. I heard her crying late at night. Sometimes there would be screaming muffled like someone was trying to keep it quiet but couldn't. And then it would just stop. Suddenly, like a switch being flipped. How often? Weekly, maybe more. For months. Edith couldn't meet his eyes. She looked instead at the ceramic cat on her railing, at the frost on her lawn, at anything that wasn't the face of a man asking her to count for her silence. I thought about calling someone. Police, child services, someone. But Curtis is so respected around here. Deacon at the church, coaches the youth soccer team, always waves when he's getting the mail. And I just didn't want to make assumptions. Didn't want to accuse a good man of something terrible if I was wrong. Did you ever see Ren once, about 8 months ago? She was getting mail from the mailbox. So thin. I could see bruises on her arms even from my porch. She looked at me and I could tell she wanted to say something. Her eyes were begging, but then Curtis came out the front door and she just froze, like a deer when the headlights hit. He smiled at me, put his arm around her, took her back inside. His hand was on the back of her neck. The way she moved, though, like she was bracing for impact, like she expected to be hit. Bones wrote everything down. Careful notes, dates approximated, details specific. Mrs. Sumner Wren has been homeless for 9 months, living on the streets of Cincinnati. She weighs 98 pounds. She has untreated fractures, rope burn, scars from prolonged restraint, and was hours from organ failure when we found her. Your neighbor did that to her. Dorothy's voice cracked. The sound of something that had been holding together through denial and convenience finally giving way. I knew something was wrong. I knew it. I just didn't want to be the one who made it worse. What if I called and I was wrong? What if I ruined his life over nothing? Tears now, real ones. The kind that come from recognizing your own cowardice after it's too late to correct it. But I wasn't wrong, was I? And that girl suffered because I chose comfort over courage. 3 doors down, Donovan knocked on 2853. Nolan Bridges answered. 44 years old, 14 years teaching history at Lincoln High before transferring to another district. The kind of teacher who kept student papers for years because he believed every piece of writing was evidence of a mind at work. Mr. Bridges, I understand you taught Ren Calloway at Lincoln High 2 years ago. Nolan's face went through a sequence of expressions that told a story of its own. Surprise, then guilt, then something close to grief. Is she alive? Is Ren okay? She's alive. Barely. No thanks to the system that was supposed to protect her. You filed a report about her. When you noticed the bruising, the weight loss, the changes in behavior. Nolan nodded slowly. His hand was on the doorframe, gripping it like it was the only thing keeping him upright. 14 months ago. Ren came to school with a black eye, said she fell, but I've been teaching for 20 years. I know the difference between clumsy and scared. I filed a report with the principal, documented everything. Photographs of the bruising, my observations of her behavior changes, a timeline of her weight loss. I put it all in writing because that's what you're supposed to do. That's what the training says. What happened to that report? Nothing, absolutely nothing. The principal called me into his office, said Curtis Langford was a respected member of the community, a deacon, a coach, said we needed to be careful about making accusations without ironclad proof. 2 weeks later, Ren stopped coming to school entirely. Curtis submitted homeschool paperwork. I called CPS to follow up. They said they'd investigated and found no concerns. You didn't push harder. Nolan's shoulders dropped. The posture of a man carrying a weight he'd picked up willingly but could never set down. I should have. I should. Every day for the last year, I've known I should have. But I had my own career to consider, my own family. The principal made it clear that pursuing this further would be seen as insubordination. And CPS said she was fine. The system said she was fine. So I told myself maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe I'd seen something that wasn't there. And I let it go because letting it go was easier than fighting. He looked at Donovan, at the leather cut, at the hellsangels patches, at the man standing on his porch who looked like everything polite society warns you about, and who was doing more for a teenage girl than every institution Nolan had trusted. I've thought about Ren every single day for a year, wondered where she was, wondered if she was okay. Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I failed her. Mr. Bridges, you tried. That's more than most people did. But yes, the system failed, every piece of it, and we're documenting every single failure so it can never happen this way again. By 9 that morning, Bones and Donovan had collected statements from 6 neighbors, each one a variation of the same confession. I saw something, I heard something, I suspected something, and I did nothing because doing nothing was easier and doing something was risky, and Curtis Langford's smile was convincing enough to make silence feel reasonable. Wire, meanwhile, was downtown at the Hamilton County Public Records Office, pulling everything available on Curtis Langford. Property records showing the mortgage payoff in full 6 months after Lena Calloway's death. Vehicle registration for the F-150 purchased 3 months after that. Court documents showing Curtis had petitioned for and received emergency guardianship of Ren after Lena's accident. But it was the insurance file that stopped Wire cold. Tucked in the same records bundle was a second policy, older than the one in Ren's name, taken out on Lena Marie Calloway 8 years before her death. Beneficiary, Curtis Anthony Langford. Payout amount, $180,000. Processed 60 days after Lena's death. And in the investigator's file marked resolved accidental death, a note from the medical examiner that had been written and then apparently ignored by everyone in the chain of authority above him. Brake line failure suspicious, given vehicle age and maintenance records. Recommend further investigation. That recommendation had been filed and forgotten. The way a system forgets things when following up requires effort, and closing the file requires only a signature. Wire called Bones. His voice carried the controlled tension of someone who has found the keystone and knows the whole arch is about to fall. We've got a pattern. Lena Calloway's death wasn't an accident. Curtis killed her for the insurance money, then positioned himself as Ren's guardian to steal her inheritance too. This is a serial predator. Lena was his first victim. Ren was supposed to be his second. Bones relayed the information to Priest. The club president closed his eyes, breathed slowly, the breathing of a man who has processed more human evil than most people encounter in a lifetime, and has learned that the only appropriate response is action so precise it leaves no room for the evil to hide. Then we make sure there's no third, Priest said. Wire pull every financial record you can legally access. I want to see every dollar Curtis Langford spent from both insurance payouts. Bones contact the medical examiner who worked Lena's case. Get their professional opinion on record. Doc coordinate with the hospital for documentation of Ren's physical condition and what it indicates about prolonged systematic abuse. At 11 that morning, while the investigation was building its case layer by documented layer, something happened that nobody in the Brotherhood had anticipated. Curtis Langford had friends. Not friends in the way that word usually means. Not people who cared about him. People who owed him or feared him or shared enough complicity in the architecture of silence that his exposure threatened their own comfort. A neighbor 4 houses down, someone Bones hadn't reached yet, had called Curtis's cell phone at 7:30 that morning, told him about the motorcycles, told him about the men in leather going door to door. And Curtis Langford, sitting in his kitchen in his khakis and his polo shirt, grease on his hands, from the truck he'd been servicing, did not panic. He called Franklin Gale. Gale was a defense attorney with offices in Over the Rhine, 54 years old, expensive suits, a reputation for getting guilty clients acquitted through procedural challenges and aggressive discrediting of witnesses. He'd defended 3 domestic abuse cases in the past 5 years and won all 3. Not because his clients were innocent, but because the system had enough holes in it that a skilled attorney could drive reasonable doubt through like a truck through a paper wall. Curtis told Gale what he needed to hear, that his stepdaughter had run away 9 months ago, that she had a history of emotional instability and pathological lying, that a motorcycle gang had apparently taken her in and was now harassing him, that he was a deacon, a coach, a man of impeccable reputation being targeted by criminals. Gale listened. Gale calculated. And within 2 hours, Gale had filed an emergency motion with the Hamilton County Family Court. The motion alleged that Ren Calloway, a minor with documented behavioral issues, had been unlawfully removed from her legal guardian's care by members of the Hellsangels Motorcycle Club, that the club had subjected her to coercive influence, that Ren's allegations of abuse were consistent with her established pattern of fabrication and attention-seeking, and that the court should issue an immediate order returning Ren to Curtis Langford's custody pending a full hearing. Gale also contacted Officer Dale Renfro at Cincinnati PD District 1, the same officer who'd handled Ren's report 6 months earlier. The one who'd called Curtis accepted his documents at face value and sent Ren back. Renfro was willing to provide a statement that Ren had come to the station making wild accusations that were contradicted by her guardian's documentation, that she appeared agitated and potentially under the influence of substances, that the report was filed as unfounded. The motion landed on Andrea Marsh's desk at 12:30 that afternoon. Andrea Marsh, assistant prosecutor, Hamilton County, 38 years old. The kind of attorney who'd gone into criminal prosecution because she believed the law was supposed to protect people who couldn't protect themselves, and then spent 15 years learning that the law mostly protected people who could afford the best interpretation of it. When Bones had brought her the case that morning, she'd been skeptical. A motorcycle club investigating child abuse? A homeless teenager's handwritten notebook as primary evidence. The whole thing sounded like a setup for a mistrial. But she'd looked at the notebook. She'd looked at the medical photographs Doc Fairfield had transmitted from UC Medical. She'd looked at the financial records Wire had compiled, and her skepticism had converted to something harder and more useful. The cold professional certainty that she was looking at a prosecutable case. Then Gale's motion arrived. Marsh read it twice. Then she called Bones. "We have a problem." Curtis Langford lawyered up fast and smart. Franklin Gale just filed an emergency motion claiming the Hells Angels kidnap Ren and are coercing her testimony. He's got a police officer willing to say Ren has a history of making false accusations, and he's requesting an emergency hearing to have Ren returned to Curtis's custody. "Return to her abuser," Bones said, his voice flat. "That's what the motion says, yes." And here's the legal reality. Right now, Curtis Langford is still Wren's legal guardian. He hasn't been charged with anything yet. The notebook is powerful, but a defense attorney will argue it's a troubled teenager's fantasy. The medical evidence shows abuse, but it doesn't prove who inflicted it. The neighbor statements show suspicion, but none of them witnessed actual abuse. What are you saying? I'm saying that without physical evidence from inside that house, without proof that the basement room exists exactly as Wren described, a good defense attorney can create enough doubt to get this motion granted. And if that happens, Wren goes back to Curtis Langford. Legally, by court order. The words settled like ice in the room where Bones stood. He was at the clubhouse with Priest and Donovan and Wire, and all four men processed the information with the particular silence of people who have just been told that the system they're trying to work within might be the very thing that destroys the person they're trying to protect. We need a warrant, Wire said. If we can get police inside that house, the basement proves everything. We can't get a warrant, Bones answered. Curtis hasn't been charged. There's no active criminal investigation. A judge won't sign a warrant based on a notebook and circumstantial evidence from a motorcycle club's private investigation. Then what do? Donovan asked. The question hung in the room. Four men, a wall of evidence, and a legal system that was about to hand a teenage girl back to the man who'd starved her and broken her and was waiting for her to die. It was Wren who answered. She wasn't supposed to be there. She was supposed to be at the hospital, resting, letting the IV antibiotics and the carefully managed meals do the work of pulling her body back from the edge. But Wren had asked Doc Fairfield to bring her to the clubhouse that afternoon because she'd heard about the motion. Word travels fast in a brotherhood, and Sawyer had texted her, and Wren had read the legal language on Sawyer's phone and understood immediately what it meant. She walked into the room wrapped in Donovan's jacket, 98 pounds of evidence and determination, and said 5 words that changed the trajectory of everything. I need to see Vernon Pratt. The room went quiet. Priest looked at her. Bones looked at her. Donovan started to say something, probably something protective, probably something about how she needed rest. But Wren kept talking. CPS has the authority to conduct home inspections without a warrant. If there's an open investigation, they can enter any home where a child's welfare is in question and inspect the premises. That's Ohio Revised Code Section 2151.421. My mother knew the statute because she dealt with CPS cases in the ER all the time. She paused, looked at the men around her, all of them older, all of them more experienced, all of them carrying the tools and knowledge and institutional weight that she lacked. Vernon Pratt closed my case 8 months ago. But if he reopens it, if CPS initiates a new investigation, they have legal authority to enter Curtis's home without his consent and without a warrant. The basement is there. The padlock is there. The mattress where I slept for 5 months is there with my blood on it from the wrist he broke. Once CPS finds that you have your physical evidence, and once you have physical evidence, Andrea Marsh can arrest Curtis and make Gail's motion irrelevant. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Bones, the 20-year detective, was staring at Wren with an expression that suggested he was recalibrating everything he thought he understood about the case and the girl at its center. You want to go talk to the man who closed your case, Priest said. The man who looked at your situation and decided everything was fine. Yes. And convince him to reopen it. Yes. Why would he listen to you now when he didn't listen before? Because before, I was a scared girl sitting on a stage bed with my abuser in the room. Now I have a notebook full of documentation, medical records proving prolonged abuse and financial evidence of embezzlement. And because Vernon Pratt has a caseload of 73 children, which means he made a mistake with me because he didn't have time to do his job properly. He's not evil. He's overwhelmed. And overwhelmed people will do the right thing if you make the right thing easy enough. Donovan started to speak. To offer to come with her. To offer protection. Support the physical presence of a man who could intimidate or persuade or whatever was needed. Wren shook her head. I need to do this alone. If I walk in there with a Hells Angels escort, Pratt will see a coerced teenager being manipulated by a motorcycle club, which is exactly what Franklin Gale is arguing. If I walk in alone with my notebook, with my evidence, and I present it calmly and clearly, Pratt will see what he should have seen 8 months ago. A girl who documented her own abuse because nobody else would. The room processed this. Priest looked at Bones. Bones looked at Donovan. Donovan looked at his hands scarred and tattooed the hands of a protector who was being asked to step back so the person he was protecting could protect herself. "We'll have brothers outside," Donovan said finally. "You won't see them, but they'll be there." Wren nodded. "That's fine, but I go in alone." She went in alone. Hamilton County Department of Job and Family Services. Second floor, room 214. The same building where she'd filed her original report 8 months ago. The same fluorescent lighting and institutional carpet and faint smell of copy toner that characterized every government office Wren had ever entered. Vernon Pratt was at his desk. The same desk. The same dark circles under his eyes. The same mountain of folders. He looked up when Wren walked in and his face went through a recognition sequence that was painful to watch. Confusion first, then placement, then understanding, then the specific pallor of a man who is looking at the consequence of his own failure. "Mr. Pratt." Wren's voice was steady. The steadiness cost her something, but she paid it. "My name is Wren Calloway. You investigated my case 8 months ago and closed it after one visit. I'm here to ask you to reopen it." "I remember you." Pratt's voice was quiet. "You were at the Langford residence. Your guardian said you had trauma from your mother's death. My guardian locked me in a basement, starved me, broke my wrist, and the bedroom he showed you was a staged guest room I'd never slept in. You interviewed me with him in the room, which is why I couldn't tell you the truth." Wren sat down in the chair across from his desk. She placed the notebook between them, opened it to the first page. This is everything she said. 14 months of documentation. Dates of every meal I was given, which averaged one per day, usually canned soup or leftovers. Hours locked in the basement, 16 to 18 per day. The condition of my wrist after he broke it. Bank statements I photographed showing he's withdrawn $127,000 from my trust account. And a verbatim transcript of a phone conversation where he discussed waiting for me to die on the street so he could collect the remaining $53,000. Pratt stared at the notebook. His hands were flat on his desk, pressed down hard, as if he needed the solid surface to keep himself from floating away. Wren continued. She walked him through the evidence page by page. Showed him the dates, showed him the bank statements, showed him the layout of the house drawn from memory, showing the basement room and the guest room, and the distance between them, making it clear that the room Pratt had inspected was 30 feet and one locked door away from the room where Wren had actually lived. She did this calmly, without anger, without tears, with the precision of someone who had learned from an ER nurse that documentation saves lives and emotion, however justified, undermines credibility. "You have a caseload of 73 children, Wren said. I know that's impossible. I know you can't give every case the attention it deserves. I'm not here to blame you for missing what Curtis hid. I'm here because you have the authority to fix it." How Pratt's voice was barely above a whisper. "Reopen my case. Initiate a new CPS investigation. Under Ohio law that gives you the authority to conduct a home inspection without a warrant. Curtis's lawyer has filed a motion to return me to his custody. If that motion succeeds before anyone sees the inside of that basement, I go back. And if I go back, I don't survive it." The silence in that small office was the kind that changes people. Vernon Pratt sat behind his desk with 73 case folders stacked around him like the walls of a fort built from other people's tragedies, and he looked at the notebook, at the evidence a 17-year-old girl had assembled while being starved and imprisoned, and he understood with absolute clarity that his signature on a closure form 8 months ago had been a death sentence that Wren had commuted through her own refusal to die. "I closed your case," he said. His voice cracked on the word closed. "I walked into that house and he showed me a clean room and I checked the boxes and I left. I didn't talk to you alone. I didn't inspect the basement. I didn't check whether the bedroom he showed me was actually yours. I had 40 minutes between appointments and I spent 20 of them in your house and I called it done. Mr. Pratt, I need you to reopen the case. Today." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled a form from his desk drawer, signed it, stamped it, picked up his phone and called his supervisor. "I'm reopening the Calloway case," he said, "immediately. And I'm requesting an emergency home inspection of the Langford residence based on new evidence of abuse and financial exploitation." The inspection happened at 3 that afternoon. Vernon Pratt, accompanied by two additional CPS investigators and a police escort that Andrea Marsh had arranged through her contacts, arrived at 2847 Thornhill Drive. Curtis answered the door. Same khakis, same polo shirt, same practiced smile. But the smile faltered when he saw Pratt's face because Curtis was smart enough to recognize the expression of a man who has stopped pretending. Mr. Langford, we're conducting an emergency inspection of the premises based on new evidence in the Callaway case. Under Ohio Revised Code 2151.421, we have the authority to inspect all areas of this home. Please step aside. My attorney advised me not to allow entry without a warrant. This isn't a police search, Mr. Langford. This is a child welfare inspection. You can comply voluntarily or I can have the court issue an emergency order within the hour. Either way, we're coming inside. Curtis stepped aside. The smile was gone now, replaced by the flat, careful expression of a man running calculations, measuring exits, weighing options. The expression Wren had seen 100 times in the basement, the face Curtis wore when he was deciding how much damage to inflict. The investigators moved through the house methodically. Kitchen clean, well-stocked with groceries Curtis had bought since Wren's escape to maintain appearances. Living room unremarkable. Guest room exactly as Pratt remembered it from 8 months ago, clean sheets, stuffed animals, textbooks on the desk. The room that had convinced him everything was fine. Then they went to the basement. The door was at the end of the hallway, white unremarkable with a slide bolt lock on the outside that would have been invisible if you weren't looking for it. Pratt looked at the lock, at the bolt mechanism designed to secure someone inside, at the scrape marks on the door frame where the bolt had been engaged thousands of times. He opened the door. The stairs descended into the smell first. Cold concrete and mildew and something else, something organic and wrong. The smell of a space where a human being had been confined for months without adequate ventilation or sanitation. At the bottom of the room, 7 feet by 10 feet, concrete floor, a thin mattress on a metal frame, the mattress stained dark in places that forensics would later confirm as blood, consistent with Wren's type. A bare bulb overhead, pull chain. A bucket in the corner that had served as a toilet during the periods when Curtis locked the door for 16-18 hours at a stretch. A window so small that escape through it required the kind of body that prolonged starvation creates, which was either coincidence or design, and nothing about Curtis Langford's operations suggested coincidence. And on the wall beside the mattress, scratched into the concrete was something sharp, perhaps a fork tine or a nail, a series of tally marks. Days. Wren had counted the days. 153 marks arranged in groups of 5, the universal notation of someone tracking time in a place where time has become meaningless. Pratt stood at the bottom of those stairs and looked at the room where Wren Callaway had spent 5 months of her life and his knees buckled. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in movies. He just sort of folded one hand going to the wall for support, the other covering his mouth. Behind him, the police officer who'd accompanied the inspection was already on his radio. Curtis Langford was arrested in his own living room. Andrea Marsh had been waiting for the call warrant prepared and signed the moment the CPS investigators confirmed the basement's existence. The charges came in a list that took the arresting officer 2 full minutes to read. Felony child abuse, unlawful restraint, theft of funds held in trust, fraud, endangerment of a minor, and conspiracy to commit murder based on the text messages Wire had recovered in the verbatim transcript in Wren's notebook. They cuffed him in the hallway where he'd broken Wren's wrist, walked him past the guest room he'd staged for CPS, past the kitchen where the air vent had carried his voice, down to the basement where a girl with a composition book had written down every word, past the truck in the driveway that he'd bought with money meant to give that girl a future. Curtis didn't speak during the arrest, didn't protest, didn't cry or rage or break down. He walked to the police cruiser with the measured steps of a man who had always known this was a possibility and had simply bet against it. The same way a gambler bets against the house knowing the odds, accepting them, believing that the percentages would hold. The percentages did not hold. Because Curtis Langford had made one critical miscalculation in his entire careful operation. He had assumed that the girl he'd broken would stay broken, that the girl he'd starved would lose the strength to fight, that the girl he'd silenced would forget how to speak. He had not accounted for the fact that Ren Calloway was Lena Calloway's daughter, that Lena had taught her to document, that Lena had taught her to act when she was the only one who could, that the stethoscope Ren carried wasn't just a memento, but a mission statement, a promise made by a 12-year-old girl on a living room floor to a mother who understood that preparation is the difference between survival and surrender. The arrest should have ended it. In a simpler story, in a cleaner narrative, the handcuffs click and the credits roll, and justice is served warm on a plate. But Curtis Langford was not finished. From the Hamilton County Detention Center, wearing an orange jumpsuit, sitting across from Franklin Gale in a consultation room that smelled like industrial cleaner, in desperation, Curtis gave instructions. "The motion stands," Curtis said. His voice hadn't changed. Still calm, still measured, still the voice of a man who sold insurance and coached soccer and killed women for money. "I want that hearing to proceed as scheduled. The emergency custody motion. I want Ren returned to my care." Gale hesitated. "The arrest changes things. The basement evidence is significant. The arrest is based on the testimony of a mentally unstable teenager who's been living with a criminal organization for the past 48 hours. Every piece of evidence traces back to her notebook, and I'll testify under oath that she had behavioral issues, that she was prone to fabrication, that the basement room was a timeout space she used voluntarily. The hearing is about custody, not criminal charges. Different standard of proof, and the judge hasn't seen the basement yet. By the time the criminal case reaches trial, I need Ren back under my roof because she's the only witness, and witnesses who live with their alleged abuser tend to recant." Gale looked at his client. At the man in the orange jumpsuit who was discussing the recantation of an abuse victim with the same tone he might use to discuss a policy renewal. And Gale, who had defended bad men before and would defend them again because the law required it, felt something shift in his assessment of the situation. But he filed the motion anyway, because that was his job, and the hearing was set for 72 hours from now. Thursday morning, Judge Helen Prescott presiding. Andrea Marsh delivered the news to Ren that evening. At the clubhouse where Ren sat with Sawyer on one side and Donovan on the other, the notebook in her lap, the stethoscope around her neck. "The arrest is solid," Marsh said. "The basement evidence is devastating. But Gale is proceeding with the custody motion anyway. The hearing is Thursday. Different courtroom, different judge, different standard. In criminal court, we need proof beyond reasonable doubt. In family court, the standard is preponderance of evidence. But Gale is going to argue that you're an unreliable witness, that the club has influenced your testimony, and that Curtis is still your legal guardian with rights that haven't been revoked." Marsh paused, looked at Ren directly. "His strategy is to get you back under his roof before the criminal trial. Because if you're living with him again, the pressure to recant becomes enormous. He doesn't need to win the criminal case. He just needs to win custody long enough to make you disappear as a witness." Ren absorbed this. The room watched her absorb it. Donovan's hand tightened on the armrest of his chair. Priest stood by the window, silhouetted against the fading light, his expression carved from the same material as gravestones. "What do I need to do?" Ren asked. Marsh said, "You'll need to testify at the hearing in front of the judge. Gale will cross-examine you. He'll try to make you look unstable, manipulated, dishonest. He'll bring up the police report from 6 months ago, where the officer called your accusations unfounded. He'll bring up the CPS closure. He'll use every institutional failure as evidence that you're the problem, not Curtis." Ren looked at the notebook in her lap, at the pages filled with her mother's handwriting and her own, at the evidence she'd gathered in darkness, in silence, in the worst conditions a human being can endure, because her mother had taught her that documentation is survival, and she had believed it even when believing anything at all felt impossible. "Then I'll testify," Ren said, "and I'll bring every page of this notebook with me, and I'll explain calmly and clearly what happened in that basement. Not because I need them to believe me, because the evidence doesn't require belief. It requires reading." She looked up at Marsh, at Donovan, at Priest. "He spent 14 months trying to make me invisible, trying to make me disappear, starving me until I was small enough to ignore, locking me in a room nobody knew existed, filing papers that said I was the problem, building a version of reality where I didn't matter. Her voice was quiet, but it filled the room the way certain sounds fill certain spaces, completely leaving no corner untouched. Thursday morning, I walk into that courtroom, and I make the judge see me. Not the version Curtis created, not the troubled teen, not the runaway. Me, Ren Calloway, Lena Calloway's daughter. The girl who documented everything because her mother taught her that if it isn't written down, it didn't happen. And everything happened. Every day of it. Every hour. Every bruise and every meal I didn't get. And every night locked in that room counting marks on the wall. She closed the notebook, held it against her chest. He thinks I'm still the girl in the basement, the one who couldn't speak when Vernon Pratt sat 3 feet away, the one who flinched, the one who made herself small. Ren stood up, 98 pounds, wrapped in a jacket 3 sizes too large, a stethoscope around her neck that belonged to a dead woman who taught her everything that mattered. I'm not that girl anymore. And on Thursday, I'm going to prove it Thursday morning, February 14th, Valentine's Day. Though nobody in courtroom 7 of the Hamilton County Family Court was thinking about love, they were thinking about custody, about a 17-year-old girl and the man who claimed the legal right to take her home. The courtroom was smaller than you'd expect, not the grand chamber with mahogany benches and vaulted ceilings that television teaches you to imagine. A functional room, fluorescent lights, industrial carpet the color of dishwater, 4 rows of seating behind a low wooden railing, a judge's bench that was really just a raised desk with a county seal mounted on the front. The kind of room where the fates of children are decided between calendar calls, where a life can change direction in the time it takes to read emotion. Judge Helen Prescott entered at 9 sharp, 61 years old, 23 years on the family court bench, silver hair cut short and practical, reading glasses that she wore on a chain around her neck and put on only when she was about to read something she suspected would make her angry. She had a reputation for 2 things, fairness and impatience. She did not tolerate attorneys who wasted her time, and she did not tolerate adults who harmed children. In the hierarchy of things, Judge Prescott despised those 2 ranked roughly equal. Franklin Gale sat at the petitioner's table, tailored suit, silver pen, the particular calm of a man who had won cases like this before and saw no reason why this one should be different. Beside him, visible through the glass partition of the video link from Hamilton County Detention, sat Curtis Langford, orange jumpsuit, clean-shaven, an expression of wounded dignity that he wore like a second skin, the suffering father whose troubled stepdaughter had been stolen by criminals. Andrea Marsh sat at the respondent's table. Beside her, a stack of folders 2 inches thick. Evidence that Wire and Bones had compiled over the past 72 hours, organized with the kind of precision that makes defense attorneys develop headaches. And beside Marsh, wearing jeans that hung loose on a frame that still carried the geography of starvation, Donovan's leather jacket draped over the back of her chair, her mother's stethoscope tucked into the bag at her feet, sat Ren Calloway. She looked at Curtis through the video screen. He looked back. And what passed between them in that 3-second exchange was something only the 2 of them fully understood. The vocabulary of captor and captive. The silent language spoken in basements and locked rooms, in the particular darkness that exists when one person holds absolute power over another. Curtis smiled at her, the smile he used at church, the smile he'd used when Vernon Pratt came to inspect a staged bedroom, the smile of a man who had always been believed because he had always looked believable. Ren did not smile back. She did not flinch. She did not look away. She held his gaze the way you hold a live wire, with full awareness of what it could do to you and the conscious decision to grip it anyway. Judge Prescott opened the proceedings. Mr. Gale, you've filed an emergency motion for return of custody. I've read the motion. I've also read the state's response. Let's hear your argument. Gale stood, buttoned his jacket, the theater of competence. Your Honor, my client is the legal guardian of Ren Calloway, duly appointed by this court following the death of her mother, Lena Calloway. 9 months ago, Ren ran away from a stable home environment. She is now in the custody of a motorcycle club, the hellsangels Ohio chapter, an organization with no legal standing as guardians and no authority to house a minor child. My client's recent arrest is based entirely on allegations made by Ren herself, allegations that are contradicted by prior CPS findings, police reports, and a documented history of behavioral issues. We are requesting the immediate return of Wren to her legal guardian pending resolution of the criminal matter. Gale paused, adjusted his cuffs, the gesture of a man who believes he has already won. Your Honor, there is no evidence of abuse that doesn't originate from Wren's own statements. A notebook she claims to have written, medical findings that could have any number of explanations, and the testimony of individuals associated with a criminal organization who have a vested interest in keeping Wren under their influence. The state has failed to provide independent corroboration of these extraordinary claims. Prescott looked at him over her reading glasses. She had put them on during his statement, which was not a good sign for Gale if he'd known her tells. Ms. Marsh, response. Andrea stood. No theater, no adjustment of clothing, just the flat, direct voice of a prosecutor who had spent the last 3 days building something that didn't need decoration. Your Honor, the state opposes the return of custody and is requesting that the court appoint temporary guardianship to the Hells Angels Ohio chapter under court supervision. The evidence will show that Curtis Langford systematically abused Wren Calloway for 5 months, stole $127,000 from her trust account, and conspired to cause her death. But rather than presenting that evidence through expert testimony or legal argument, the state requests that Wren Calloway be permitted to address the court directly. Gale was on his feet immediately. Objection. The minor is not a qualified witness. She has documented behavioral issues and is currently under the influence of individuals with criminal records. Judge Prescott looked at Gale, then at Wren, then back at Gale. Mr. Gale, I've been hearing cases in this courtroom for 23 years. In that time, I have learned that the person best qualified to describe what happened to a child is usually the child. I'll allow Ms. Calloway to speak. You'll have your opportunity to cross-examine. Sit down. Gale sat, his jaw tightened, but he sat. Ms. Calloway, Judge Prescott's voice softened by exactly 1 degree. You may address the court. Wren stood, 98 pounds. The chair scraped against the floor as she pushed it back, and the sound was louder than it should have been in that quiet room. She picked up the notebook from the table, the blue composition book with the waterproof cover. 14 months of documentation, her mother's handwriting on the early pages, her own handwriting on the rest. She walked to the front of the courtroom, stood facing the judge, not behind a podium because there wasn't one, just standing in open space with a notebook and the particular courage of someone who has rehearsed this moment in the dark for 9 months and is finally being given the stage. Your Honor, my name is Wren Calloway. I'm 17 years old. My mother, Lena Calloway, was an emergency room nurse at Good Samaritan Hospital for 15 years. She died 14 months ago in what was classified as a single-car accident on Route 32. Curtis Langford, her boyfriend, became my legal guardian. Wren opened the notebook, not to the first page, to a page she'd marked with a small fold in the corner. Within 2 months of my mother's death, Curtis moved me from my bedroom to a basement storage room. The room was 7 feet by 10 feet, concrete floor, one window 14 inches by 18 inches, a padlock on the outside of the door. He locked me in that room for 16 to 18 hours a day. He fed me once daily, usually canned soup or leftovers. He broke my right wrist on March 28th when I attempted to leave the house. She turned a page, each movement deliberate, each sentence delivered with the measured cadence of someone who has learned that truth, when spoken plainly, needs no amplification. My mother taught me 2 things that are relevant to these proceedings. The first is CPR, which I used 4 days ago to save the life of Sawyer Harding, the 16-year-old daughter of Donovan Harding. The second is documentation. My mother was meticulous about charting in the ER. She said if it isn't written down, it didn't happen. So I wrote everything down. Wren held up the notebook. This contains 14 months of entries, dates and times of every meal I was given, hours spent locked in the basement, photographs of bank statements I took using my mother's phone, which I hid in the ceiling tiles, a verbatim transcript of a phone conversation I overheard through the air vent connecting the basement to the kitchen, in which Curtis Langford discussed waiting for me to die so he could collect the remaining $53,000 of my trust fund. She turned to the page. Read the words she had written in the dark on a thin mattress with a broken wrist 14 months ago. Curtis said, and I quote, "It's not like with Lena. That was actually an accident. This is just letting nature take its course. I stopped feeding her. I make winter hard enough. She either runs or gets sick. Either way, it solves itself. By spring, this is done. Memorial service. Sad story about a troubled teen, and I can finally move on with my life. The courtroom was silent, not the silence of an empty room, the silence of a room full of people who have stopped breathing. Judge Prescott had removed her reading glasses. She held them in her right hand, motionless, the chain hanging still against her blouse. On the video screen, Curtis Langford's expression had not changed. Still the wounded father, still the wrongly accused, but something in his eyes had shifted, a calculation being revised, a probability being recalculated. Wren continued, Mr. Gale states that there is no evidence of abuse independent of my statements. I'd like to address that directly. This notebook contains references to physical evidence that CPS investigators found in the Langford residence 2 days ago. The basement room exactly as I described it, with the padlock, the mattress, the window, and 91 tally marks I scratched into the concrete wall to count the days. Blood on the mattress that matches my blood type. Rope fiber embedded in the doorframe consistent with the ligature marks on my wrists. These are not allegations, Your Honor. They are facts, documented by me and corroborated by physical evidence that Curtis Langford did not have time to destroy because he did not know CPS was coming. She closed the notebook, held it against her chest the way she'd held it for 9 months on the street, the way you hold the only thing that proves you exist. Mr. Gale also states that I have a documented history of behavioral issues. The documentation he's referring to was fabricated by Curtis Langford. Fake medical records created using letterhead purchased online. Forged school reports, text messages Curtis sent to himself from a burner phone to create a paper trail of a troubled teenager who doesn't exist. Wren paused, looked at Gale, then at the video screen, then at the judge. I'm not troubled, Your Honor. I'm not unstable. I'm not a liar, and I'm not under anyone's influence. I'm a 17-year-old girl whose mother was murdered and whose guardian locked her in a basement and stole her inheritance and planned to let her freeze to death on the street. And I survived because my mother taught me that when you're the only one who can act, you act. Even if your hands shake, even if you're terrified, you act. She set the notebook on the judge's bench, placed it there deliberately like an offering, like evidence, like the culmination of everything she'd endured and documented and carried through 9 months of homelessness and 4 institutional failures in a February morning where she'd knelt on frozen concrete for 8 minutes to save a stranger's life. Everything is in there, Wren said. Every date, every detail, every word he said when he thought nobody was listening. I am asking this court to read it, and then I am asking this court to make sure I never have to go back to that house. She walked back to her seat, sat down, placed her hands flat on the table, and if they were trembling, it was the kind of trembling that comes from adrenaline rather than fear. Gale stood for cross-examination. He had prepared questions, pointed questions designed to expose contradictions, to suggest fabrication, to paint Wren as a manipulative teenager who had constructed an elaborate lie. He had done this before with other witnesses and other victims, and it had worked because the legal system rewards confidence over truth and people who can afford good attorneys over people who can't afford dinner. But something had changed in the room, something Gale could feel but couldn't name. The temperature of the proceedings had shifted, and when he looked at Judge Prescott, he saw something he hadn't expected. She was angry, not visibly. Prescott was too experienced for visible anger. But her questions to Gale during cross had an edge. When he asked Wren about her mental health history, Prescott sustained Marsh's objection before Marsh finished making it. When Gale attempted to introduce Officer Renfro's statement about Wren's previous report being unfounded, Prescott looked at the statement for exactly 4 seconds and said an officer who accepted a suspect's documentation at face value without independent verification is not a credible source on the validity of that suspect's victim's claims. Gale tried 3 more approaches. Each one met the same wall. Prescott was not hostile. She was precise. She asked follow-up questions that dismantled Gale's premises before he could build on them. She requested documentation that Gale couldn't provide because his documentation was fabricated by a client who'd assumed the fabrication would never be tested against reality. And then Andrea Marsh called her final witness. Not Wren, not Bones or Wire or Donovan. She called someone whose testimony would crack the case open along a fault line nobody had seen. The state calls Dr. Kathleen Fairfield. Doc Fairfield took the stand, composed, professional, the demeanor of a woman who had testified in courtrooms before and understood that her job was to present facts and let the facts do the work that emotion couldn't. Dr. Fairfield Marsh began, "You examined Ren Calloway at UC Medical on February 10th. Can you describe her condition? Severe malnutrition. BMI of 14.8, which is classified as dangerously underweight. Bilateral rope burns on both wrists consistent with prolonged restraint. A right radius fracture that healed without medical intervention resulting in malunion that will require surgical correction. Pneumonia in both lungs. An overall physical presentation consistent with sustained deprivation over a period of months. In your medical opinion, could these injuries be self-inflicted or the result of living on the street? The Malunian fracture was caused by a single acute trauma event and consistent with the bone being forcibly snapped. That is not a street injury. The rope burns show layered healing indicating repeated restraint over weeks or months with the same type of ligature. The malnutrition pattern shows chronic caloric restriction beginning well before the period of homelessness. These are not the injuries of a runaway. These are the injuries of someone who was held captive and systematically deprived." Doc paused. Then she said something that was not in the prosecutor's script. "I also want to note for the record that I knew Ren's mother. Lena Calloway and I worked together at Good Samaritan Hospital before I transferred to UC Medical. She was one of the finest nurses I've ever worked with. Meticulous, compassionate, dedicated to documentation because, as she believed, accurate records saved lives. The notebook Ren presented to this court reflects training that Lena gave her daughter. It is not the fabrication of a disturbed teenager. It is the work of a young woman who was taught by a medical professional to document what she observed and who applied that training under conditions most adults would not survive." Gale objected. "Character testimony." "Irrelevant." Prescott overruled him without looking up from the notebook she was reading. Ren's notebook. She'd been reading it since Ren placed it on her bench, turning pages with the careful attention of someone who understands that every line was written in darkness by hands that hurt. And then Marsh played her final card. "Your Honor, the state has one additional piece of evidence. During the preparation of this case, forensic investigators re-examined the circumstances of Lena Calloway's death 14 months ago. The original finding was accidental death due to brake failure. However, the medical examiner's file contained a notation, and I quote, "Brake line failure, suspicious given vehicle age and maintenance records, recommend further investigation." That recommendation was never acted upon. Marsh paused. Let the weight of that settle. In the course of his investigation, our forensic analysts recovered additional information. Curtis Langford borrowed Lena's vehicle the morning of her death. He told her he needed to run errands. The vehicle was 3 years old with a clean maintenance record. Brake lines on a vehicle of that age and condition do not fail spontaneously. She turned to the notebook on the judge's bench. And in Ren Calloway's notebook, in an entry made 11 months ago, 5 months before she escaped, there is a detail that Ren recorded at the time without understanding its significance. On the evening of her mother's death, Curtis returned home with fluid stains on his hands and clothing. When Ren asked about it, Curtis said he'd been helping a neighbor fix their car. Ren documented this because her mother had taught her to document everything. Marsh looked at the judge. The fluid has since been identified through forensic analysis of Curtis's clothing, which was seized during the arrest as brake fluid. The neighbor Curtis claimed to have helped has confirmed that Curtis did not visit his home that day and that his car required no repairs. Your Honor, Curtis Langford tampered with the brake lines on Lena Calloway's vehicle, causing the single car accident that killed her. He then collected $180,000 in insurance money, positioned himself as guardian of Lena's daughter, and systematically stole her inheritance while planning to let her die. The courtroom did not breathe. Ren sat at the table with her hands flat on the surface and her mother's stethoscope in the bag at her feet and tears running silently down her face because the thing she had suspected for 14 months, the thing she had documented and analyzed and carried like a stone in her chest, was now being spoken aloud in a courtroom by a woman in a suit who had the power to make it matter. Curtis Langford on the video screen had stopped performing. The wounded father was gone. The wrongly accused was gone. What remained was the face underneath the real face, the one Ren had seen in the basement when he broke her wrist and told her nobody would believe her. The face of a man who understood that the architecture of his deception was collapsing and that no amount of charm or fabricated documents or expensive attorneys could rebuild it. Franklin Gale asked for a recess. Judge Prescott denied it. Gale asked to withdraw the custody motion. Prescott denied that too. Mr. Gale, I am going to rule on this motion, and I am going to do it right now because there is a 17-year-old girl in my courtroom who has been waiting 9 months for someone in a position of authority to say what I am about to say. She looked at Wren. Ms. Calloway, please stand. Wren stood. I have read your notebook. Every page. I have reviewed the medical evidence, the financial records, the CPS reports, and the testimony presented today. I have also reviewed the original CPS investigation that cleared Curtis Langford 8 months ago, and I want to say something about that directly. Prescott removed her glasses, set them on the bench. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 23 years of watching the system fail the people it was designed to protect. You went to CPS, they closed your case. You went to the police, they sent you back to your abuser. You went to a shelter, they turned you away for lack of documentation. You went to a hospital. They treated your symptoms and ignored your scars. 4 institutions, 4 failures, each one a door that should have opened and didn't. And through all of that, through 5 months of captivity and 9 months of homelessness, you kept writing in that notebook. You kept documenting. You kept gathering evidence because your mother taught you that if it isn't written down, it didn't happen. Prescott paused. Her voice, when it continued, was steady in the way that steady things are steady, not because they don't feel the strain, but because they choose to bear it. The motion to return custody to Curtis Langford is denied. The court finds that Curtis Langford poses an immediate and ongoing threat to the safety and welfare of Wren Calloway. The court further finds that the Hells Angels Ohio chapter, under the leadership of Garrett Whitmore, has demonstrated a capacity and commitment to protect this child that exceeds anything the state's institutions have managed to provide. She looked at Priest, who was sitting in the gallery with Donovan and Bones and Wire. 4 men in leather cuts in a family courtroom, looking like everything the system warned you about, and acting like everything the system claimed to be. I am granting temporary protective custody of Wren Calloway to the Hells Angels Ohio chapter under supervision of the state. Weekly check-ins with a court-appointed advocate, monthly reviews of living conditions, medical care, and educational progress. This arrangement will remain in effect until Wren reaches the age of majority on November 3rd. Prescott looked at Wren. Ms. Calloway, does this arrangement feel safe to you? Wren nodded, then found her voice. Yes, Your Honor, it feels safe. Prescott nodded once. Then she said something that was not part of any legal ruling, but that would be remembered and quoted long after the case file was archived. In 23 years on this bench, I have never granted custody to a motorcycle club. I suspect I never will again. But this case has taught me something I should have learned a long time ago. Family is not defined by blood or by legal paperwork or by the institutions we've built to administer it. Family is defined by who shows up when a child is drowning. And in this case, the people who showed up were not the caseworkers or the police officers or the school administrators. They were 180 men on motorcycles who rode through the night because a 17-year-old girl needed them. She closed the file. Court is adjourned. Curtis Langford's criminal case moved forward on a separate track. The evidence was devastating. The financial records alone would have secured a conviction. The text messages, the deleted emails. Wire had recovered the physical evidence from the basement. The neighbor testimonies, each piece interlocking with the others, like the components of a machine designed to do one thing, that to prove beyond any reasonable doubt that Curtis Langford had systematically destroyed a child's life for money. Franklin Gale withdrew as counsel 3 days after the hearing. He cited irreconcilable differences, which is the legal profession's way of saying, my client is guilty and I don't want my name attached to the outcome. Curtis's new attorney, a public defender named Paul Westbrook, reviewed the evidence and advised his client to negotiate. The prosecution offered 8 years in state prison, no parole eligibility for 5 years. In exchange, Curtis would plead guilty to felony child abuse, unlawful restraint, theft of funds held in trust, and fraud. The conspiracy charge would be dropped, but the investigation into Lena Calloway's death would continue as a separate matter. Curtis took the deal in April. The sentencing hearing was held on a Tuesday, the same day of the week as Lena's funeral, which was either coincidence or the universe's idea of structural symmetry. Wren sat in the courtroom, Donovan on her right, Sawyer on her left, Priest and Doc behind them, Bones near the prosecutor's table. Wire in the back row documenting everything because Wire always documented everything. Judge Prescott, who had been assigned the criminal case as well, through a jurisdictional alignment that some called unusual and others called appropriate, looked at Curtis Langford standing in his orange jumpsuit and delivered a statement that would be quoted in every news article written about the case. Mr. Langford, you were entrusted with the care of a child who had just lost her mother. Instead of protecting her, you imprisoned her. Instead of nurturing her, you starved her. Instead of honoring the memory of the woman who trusted you with her daughter's life, you stole from that daughter and plotted to let her die. Prescott's voice did not rise. It didn't need to. You are a predator who wore the mask of respectability, a deacon who locked a child in a basement, a coach who broke a teenager's wrist, a guardian who counted the days until his ward would freeze to death on the street and he could collect the insurance money. The court sentences you to 8 years in state prison. I only wish the law allowed me to give you more. Curtis looked back at Wren once as they led him away. One look. And Wren saw what was in his face, not remorse, not guilt, not the dawning recognition of what he'd done. Rage. Pure and simple, the rage of a man who had been caught, who had run every calculation and played every angle and still lost because he had underestimated a girl he'd assumed was already destroyed. Wren did not flinch, did not look away. She held his gaze across the courtroom, the way she'd held it across the video screen at the hearing, and the way she'd held her hand steady on Sawyer's sternum for 8 minutes on frozen concrete. With the quiet, absolute certainty of someone who knows that the worst is behind her, and the person who put her through it no longer has the power to make her small. The weeks after the sentencing moved at a different speed, slower, gentler, the velocity of recovery rather than crisis. Wren moved into an apartment 3 blocks from the clubhouse. 2 bedrooms furnished by brothers who'd pooled resources, rent paid 6 months in advance from club funds. Priest had been explicit that this was not charity. This is investment in family, he said. And family earns its keep, which means you're going to school, and you're eating 3 meals a day, and you're letting Doc monitor your health until she says you're clear. Those aren't suggestions. Doc Fairfield visited daily for the first 3 weeks. Refeeding syndrome was the immediate concern, a dangerous condition where a starved body suddenly given adequate nutrition can go into metabolic shock. Every meal was planned, every calorie counted, small portions 6 times a day, progressing gradually as Wren's body remembered how to process food. Your digestive system essentially shut down to conserve energy, Doc explained. We have to restart it slowly. Think of it like restarting an engine that's been sitting in a garage for a year. You don't just turn the key and floor it. You check the fluids, prime the pump, let it idle before you put it in gear. By the end of March, Wren had gained 12 pounds. Still underweight, still fragile in ways that wouldn't show on a scale, but no longer critical, no longer hovering at the edge of the cliff where organs begin to fail and the body starts consuming itself. In April, the corrective surgery on her wrist. Pins and plates to reset the bone that Curtis had broken and never treated. 3 hours in the operating room. 6 weeks in a clinic. Physical therapy twice a week at a VA clinic that Wire had arranged through his military connections because the VA physical therapists were the best in the city and Wire knew all of them. And therapy, real therapy. Twice a week with Dr. Claire Thornton, a psychologist who specialized in trauma survivors and who operated out of a small office on Reading Road with plants in the window and a golden retriever named Hemingway, who served as an unofficial therapy dog. Healing isn't linear, Dr. Thornton said in their first session. Hemingway's head was resting on Wren's knee, which is what golden retrievers do when they sense that someone needs grounding. Some days you'll feel strong. Some days you'll feel like you're back in that basement. Both are normal. Both are part of the process. The goal isn't to forget what happened. The goal is to make sure what happened doesn't get to decide what happens next. Wren learned to talk about the basement, about the hunger, about the sound of the padlock clicking shut every night at 9 and the particular darkness that exists when the only window is 14 inches wide and the only light is a bare bulb on a pull chain. She talked about the conversation she'd overheard through the vent, about the moment she understood that Curtis was waiting for her to die, about the 3 days between that conversation and Her escape when she lay in the dark and made the decision to survive. She talked about her mother, about cinnamon coffee on Sunday mornings and CPR lessons on the living room floor, about the stethoscope with L. Calloway engraved on the bell, about the ache of missing someone so completely that the missing becomes a physical location, a place you carry inside your body. And she talked about the morning outside the roastery, about Sawyer falling, about the 8 minutes, about the choice to kneel on frozen concrete and fight for a stranger's life when her own life was barely worth the weight it carried. "Why did you do it?" Dr. Thornton asked. Wren was quiet for a long time. Hemingway's tail thumped softly against the carpet. "Because my mother's voice was in my head, and she was saying, 'You don't get to freeze. You act.' And because if I walked past that girl, if I stood there with everyone else and just watched, then everything my mother taught me was meaningless. And I couldn't let that be true. I couldn't let Curtis take that from me, too." May arrived, then June. Wren's body continued its slow restoration. Her face filled out, the dark circles faded. Her hair, which had been brittle and thin from malnutrition, grew back thick and dark. She started running in the morning short distances at first, building up her lungs, clearing her legs, remembering what it felt like to move without pain. Sawyer became her closest friend, the first real friend Wren had in 2 years. They studied together at Wren's apartment, Sawyer helping Wren catch up on the education that Curtis had stolen. 2 years of missed school, history and literature and mathematics, and the thousand small pieces of knowledge that most 17-year-olds absorb without realizing how lucky they are to have the chance. Sawyer never treated Wren like a project or a charity case, never looked at her with the particular softness that people use when they see a victim rather than a person. She treated Wren like a friend, which meant arguing about music and laughing at bad movies and complaining about homework and all the ordinary, unremarkable interactions that constitute normal teenage life, and that Wren had been denied for so long she'd forgotten they existed. "You should come to my soccer game Saturday," Sawyer said one afternoon. They were sprawled on the living room floor, textbooks open, a bowl of popcorn between them. "Dad's bringing half the club as my personal cheering section. It's mortifying, but also kind of the greatest thing ever." Wren smiled. The expression still felt new on her face. Unfamiliar muscles remembering an unfamiliar configuration. But it was real, not performed, not the careful imitation of happiness that trauma survivors learn to produce for the benefit of people who need to believe you're okay. A real smile emerging from a real moment in a real life that was slowly, carefully being rebuilt from the foundation up. "Yeah," Wren said, "I'd like that." Donovan became the father figure Wren hadn't known she needed. Every Tuesday and Thursday, he'd pick her up for what he called recovery sessions that were really just life. Breakfast at a diner, teaching Wren that it was okay to eat in public, that no one would take her plate away, that she could order whatever she wanted and finish it or not finish it, and either choice was fine. Sometimes it was a ride on the back of his Harley, the wind in her face, and the engine beneath her, and the particular freedom that comes from moving fast through open space with someone you trust. "You saved my daughter's life," Donovan said one morning, over eggs and toast. "That means you're family now, not replacing your mom. Nobody replaces Lena Calloway. But you've got people who will show up for you, who will be at the school events, in the doctor's appointments, in the bad days when everything feels impossible. You understand? You've got people now." Summer passed. Wren's weight stabilized at 115 pounds. Her wrist healed. The physical therapy restored most of the range of motion, though the joint would always ache in cold weather, a permanent souvenir from a man who is now sitting in a cell at Lebanon Correctional Institution, 2 hours south of Cincinnati. In September, Andrea Marsh called with news. The investigation into Lena Calloway's death had reached its conclusion. The medical examiner had officially reclassified Lena's death from accidental to suspicious. The brake fluid found on Curtis's clothing matched the fluid from Lena's vehicle. The neighbor Curtis claimed to have helped had provided a sworn statement that Curtis never visited his home that day. The forensic reconstruction of the brake failure was consistent with deliberate tampering. A grand jury had been convened. An indictment was expected by November. "It won't bring her back," Marsh said on the phone. Her voice, usually crisp and professional, had a quality to it that suggested she was fighting something. "But if the grand jury indicts Curtis Langford, will face murder charges in addition to his current sentence. He will likely spend the rest of his life in prison. Wren sat in her apartment. Sawyer was next to her. Donovan was in the kitchen making coffee because Donovan was always either making coffee or riding his motorcycle or doing something protective with his hands. The stethoscope hung from a hook by the front door, the first thing Wren saw every morning and the last thing she saw every night. Good, Wren said. She deserves justice too. October. The leaves on the trees along Wren's street turned gold and red in the particular autumn paladin of Ohio that makes the whole state look like it's on fire in the gentlest possible way. Wren walked to class in the mornings, through corridors of color, and each day felt like a page turning in a book she was writing herself, word by word, step by step, one meal at a time. She'd made a decision in August, not prompted by anyone, not suggested by Donovan, or Priest, or Doc, or Dr. Thornton. Her own decision arrived at through the process of figuring out who Wren Calloway was when she wasn't running or hiding or surviving. She enrolled in the EMT certification program at Cincinnati State Technical College. Emergency medical technician, the first step on the road her mother had walked. Not because anyone told her to, because she'd knelt on frozen concrete for 8 minutes and brought a girl back to life. And the feeling of being the person who acts when everyone else watches, was the closest thing to her mother she could reach. The program started in January, but Wren began studying in October, medical terminology that lived in her blood because Lena had used it at the dinner table, the way other parents use small talk: anatomy, pharmacology, trauma response, patient assessment. Each chapter a conversation with her mother's memory. Each clinical procedure a continuation of the education that had started on a living room floor with a practice mannequin and a 12-year-old girl who rolled her eyes at CPR November 3rd, Wren's 18th birthday. The clubhouse was transformed. Streamers, balloons, a cake that Sawyer had ordered from the bakery on Vine Street, chocolate with vanilla frosting because Sawyer had asked Wren's preference 2 weeks ago in a way that was supposed to be casual but wasn't. 75 people filled the space. Brothers and their families, Sawyer and her friends from the soccer team, Doc Fairfield and her husband, Bones and Wire, Andrea Marsh, who had become something between a legal advocate and a friend over the course of 9 months, Dr. Thornton, who came with Hemingway, and the golden retriever made the rounds of the room like a furry diplomat, collecting affection from every person he passed. Even Judge Prescott, who had received an invitation through Andrea and had accepted because there are cases that stay with you, and Wren Calloway's was one of those cases. Wren stood in the center of the room wearing jeans that fit a 120-pound frame and a Hell's Angels t-shirt that Sawyer had bought her as a joke but that Wren wore with genuine pride. Her wrist was free of the brace. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, clean and thick. The shadows under her eyes had faded. Her cheeks had filled. She looked 17. For the first time in 2 years, she looked exactly her age. Not younger, not hollowed, not carrying the visible evidence of what had been done to her. A young woman standing in a room full of people who had chosen to be there because she mattered to them, and the knowledge of that mattering, the physical reality of it expressed in the streamers and cake, and 75 voices singing happy birthday was almost more than she could hold. Donovan brought out the cake. The candles flickered. The singing was loud and off-key and perfect. Wren blew out the candles and made a wish, and for the first time in her life, the wish felt like something that might actually happen rather than something she was screaming in to avoid. After the cake, after the presents, after the laughter and the conversations and the particular warmth that fills a room when people are genuinely happy to be together, Priest pulled Wren aside, handed her an envelope. "What's this? Open it." Inside was a bank statement. The trust account in Wren's name. Balance $53,847.12. The money Curtis hadn't managed to steal. And beneath it, a second statement showing an additional $42,000 raised by Hell's Angels chapters across Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana. Brothers who'd heard Wren's story and sent what they could. "That's yours," Priest said. "All of it. For college, for trade school, for the EMT program, for whatever future you want to build." He paused. Looked at this girl who'd come into his life weighing 98 pounds and carrying a notebook and a stethoscope, and nothing else, and who was now standing in his clubhouse at 120 pounds, with color in her face and light in her eyes, and the particular straightness of posture that belongs to people who have learned they don't need to make themselves small. And one more thing, Doc's Hospital is accepting you into their EMT training program starting January, paid position as a trainee, benefits, mentorship from some of the best paramedics in the city. Ren looked at the numbers on the page, at the money that represented a future she'd been told she wouldn't live to see, at the investment that $95,000 of strangers' faith represented, at the evidence more powerful than anything in her notebook that she was not invisible, had never been invisible, had only been surrounded by people who chose not to look. I don't know what to say. Priest put his hand on her shoulder, gently, the way you touch someone who has flinched from hands for so long that every gentle touch is a lesson in relearning what hands can be. Say you'll use it. Say you'll build something beautiful out of everything ugly you survived. Say you'll be happy. Ren hugged him. This man who'd lost his own daughter to violence and had spent 15 years converting that grief into protection for other people's children. Who'd mobilized 180 men because he believed that protecting the vulnerable wasn't just a duty, but a sacred one. Who'd stood on a suburban street at dawn and directed an evidence operation with the precision of a military campaign because a girl he'd never met needed someone to fight for her. Thank you, she whispered, for seeing me when I was invisible. You were never invisible, Ren. You were just surrounded by people who chose not to look. But once someone really sees you, once someone decides you matter, you can't be unseen. You become permanent. You become part of the story. And your story, Ren Calloway, is one of the best ones I've ever been part of. Ren started the EMT program in January, found she had her mother's gift, the steady hands, the calm voice, the ability to walk into chaos and see past the noise to the person who needed help. She carried Lena's stethoscope in her locker, used it on every shift. Not because she needed it, the hospital-issued equipment was perfectly adequate, but because pressing those earpieces into her ears and placing that bell against a patient's chest was the closest she could come to working beside her mother again. She made honor roll every semester, became president of the EMT student organization, started speaking at high schools across Hamilton County about recognizing the signs of abuse, about the importance of documenting what you see, about what it means to act when everyone else is watching. She saved 3 lives in her first 6 months on the job. A cardiac arrest at a grocery store, a child choking at a birthday party, an elderly man who collapsed at a bus stop while 14 people stood around him with their phones out. Ren didn't record any of those moments. She knelt. She placed her hands. She counted. She breathed. She did what her mother taught her to do. The case left marks on the system too. Hamilton County CPS implemented mandatory solo interviews with minors. No exceptions, no parental presence during initial assessments. Follow-up visits within 30 days of any abuse report. Vernon Pratt, who had reopened the case and helped bring Curtis down, became an advocate for caseload reform, testifying before the state legislature about the impossible mathematics of 73 children and 40-minute appointments. Andrea Marsh's office rewrote its protocols for evaluating abuse claims against respected community members. No more deference to reputation. No more accepting a suspect's documentation without independent verification. Ohio passed what the press called Ren's Law, requiring independent financial audits of all trust accounts involving minors with deceased parents. 4 other districts adopted similar oversight programs within the year. And on the wall of the Riverside Roastery near the entrance where Ren had once sat invisible against the brick, the owner mounted a small brass plaque in honor of Ren Calloway, who taught us that heroes don't always look like what we expect. Sometimes they look like someone everyone else stopped seeing. Every February 10th, Ren and Sawyer meet at the roastery, sit at a table by the window, order coffee. Ren drinks hers with cinnamon because some rituals are inherited and some connections transcend the distance between the living and the dead. They don't talk about the morning it happened, not usually. They talk about classes and work and soccer games and the ordinary business of being alive, which is itself a form of victory for 2 girls who came close enough to death to feel its breath on their faces. Sometimes Donovan joins them, sometimes Priest, sometimes the whole table fills with brothers and their families. Leather jackets and coffee cups, and the low hum of conversation between people who chose each other because blood makes you related, but loyalty makes you family. Curtis Langford is serving his sentence at Lebanon Correctional. The grand jury indicted him on one count of murder in the first degree for the death of Lena Calloway. That trial is pending. The evidence is strong. When it concludes, Curtis Langford will likely never see the outside of a prison again. Ren doesn't think about him often. Some nights in the space between waking and sleeping, his face surfaces like something rising from deep water. The smile he wore for the neighbors, the sound of the padlock, the words through the vent by spring. This is done spoken with the casual certainty of a man who believed he had already won. But then she opens her eyes, and she's in her apartment, and the stethoscope is hanging by the door, and the notebook is on the shelf closed now, its work done. And outside her window, the city is waking up the way cities do, slowly and all at once, with traffic sounds and bird song and the distant rumble of a motorcycle engine that might be Donovan heading to the clubhouse or might be nobody at all. And Ren Calloway gets up, gets dressed, pins her EMT badge to her uniform, puts her mother's stethoscope in her bag, and goes to work. Because Lena Calloway taught her daughter two things: how to save a life and how to document the truth. And Ren has spent every day since proving that both lessons were worth learning, that both skills are worth having, that the girl everyone stepped over on a frozen February morning was never invisible at all. She was just waiting for the right moment to stand up.